Good evening to all, and welcome to tonight's workshop, Housing Within a Corporate Capitalist Society. This is the second in a series of workshops focused on meeting the housing needs of people living in Franklin County. This workshop forum or series is presented by Franklin County Continuing the Political Revolution and Green and Greenfield, and came out of our deep concern that there are way too many people in our area who cannot find quality, affordable housing, and that the situation continues to grow worse as the gap between the rich and the poor grows larger and the supply of housing does not keep up with demand. There was a story in the Recorder, the local Greenfield paper, just on Tuesday saying that housing prices are just going out of sight as the supply of housing in our area shrinks. Many of us assume that housing is a right, or should be a right, along with having enough to eat, having adequate clothing, and access to medical care. But as we know, we have none of those things in the US. Making matters worse, housing has become a commodity, a way for people to make money. While from a human and social services point of view, the issue of housing is to provide people with a safe and stable place to live. From a corporate capitalist perspective, housing has become an investment strategy. It's part of a portfolio. Investors, foreign and domestic, have bought up real estate, driving up prices and profits for investors while limiting supply, while making it what is available and affordable to those who are low income. Mix in with that an unhealthy dose, a toxic dose of racism and usurious banking practices, and we find ourselves in the disastrous housing situation we are in. Consider, for example, the subprime mortgage disaster that brought the world into financial crisis 10 years ago. That was never about housing. It was always about greed, about profits for financial firms and banks. Tonight, we will take some time to understand how it is that the wealthiest country in the history of the world has millions of people without housing or without adequate housing. It's clearly not because we can't afford to house all of us. The fact is that we have millions of people living in poverty, living without adequate housing, because we've made that choice as a society, or our leaders have. And if it's a choice to have things the way they are now, it can be a choice to change things. And that's why we're here tonight. We'll hear about the role that racism has played in the housing market, about the role that capitalism plays in keeping demand high and supply tight, which means that housing prices are on the rise. And we will explore some possible actions to change this dynamic. We hope you will leave this workshop, in this workshop series, with a greater understanding of why things as they are, and with a readiness to act together with others to make change. Today's panelists, to help us learn more about housing within a corporate capitalist society, are Tracy Talbert and Gianpaolo Beacci. Want to make a brief comment that we're going to keep you on mute while the panelists are speaking. If you have a comment you'd like to make, please write the word stack in the chat, and we will then respond to your indications in the order that they're received. So we'll all stay on mute. Panelists will finish, and then we'll have a conversation to explore what's come up and what questions you bring. So starting us off is going to be Tracy Talbert. Tracy is the Racial Justice Community Engagement Leader for Franklin County CDC. She's the founder of the African American Female Professors Awards Association, a nonprofit that works to both celebrate African American female faculty, as well as uncover systemic equity issues in higher education. She's an adjunct professor at Bay Path University and Cambridge College. Tracy teaches diversity in the workplace, leadership, business ethics, and the capstone research course. So with that, Tracy Talbert.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I first want to say that I'm so honored and thrilled to be amongst you, to see so many faces that are participating and engaging in this work around housing. First of all, I think it's important for me to emphasize right off the bat that I am not a housing guru. I don't work in any of those industries as far as laws and governance with regards to public housing subsidy or any of the tax laws that are associated with housing. But I am going to speak to you from a place of experience and my lived personal voice with regards to racial justice. As Doug mentioned, I am the Racial Justice Community Engagement Leader for Franklin County. I've been in that position since November. And I must say that everyone in this community has been so welcoming and inviting and supportive to this work that I'm doing. Although my primary focus for my role there is to work with the business community around racial justice issues and helping them to kind of take a look at some systemic and some policy-driven processes internally to see where there might be some ways where they can kind of alleviate or relax some policies directly related to racism, discrimination, and inequities, though sometimes it may not directly be, or it may not be intentional. Even though that is my primary role, I can't help but think more about those inequities that unite us, regardless of what our role is in the community, our professional lives, our careers, however we show up to make change, and regardless of what industries we may be in. Those things that unite us is why we're all here today. So when I think about affordable housing as it relates to human rights, three major matters come to mind, and I'm going to talk briefly about three things. First is going to be the financial dynamics. We all know that money plays a significant role in who gets affordable housing and where you actually live, right? Then we're going to talk a little bit about the community attitude. And lastly, affordable housing, public housing, and housing in general. What are some of those differences, which I'm sure maybe many of you have already have a good idea about what those things are. So before I actually get into those overviews, define a capitalist society. So we all know that capitalism is a system, right, in which policies, practices, and laws mainly benefit business owners. So when Doug talked about the capitalist corporate society and who really benefits from these types of systems and policies that are enacted. New and old elites use policies within systems to maximize their wealth. And let me say that again. New and old elites use politics within systems to maximize their wealth. And that includes, again, what Doug mentioned about housing as a commodity and how people are using it to kind of further or put more money in their pockets. So policy, regulations, and system, who do they help? Who do they hurt? And I'm hoping that those questions, when we're done, that you'll be able to kind of chime in and provide some feedback about that. So policies and systems, who do they help? Who do they hurt? So back to the major matters. Some of the financial dynamics. I spent 22 years in the banking world. I crawled up the corporate ladder, worked my way up into a branch manager for People's Bank and other banks in the South for many years. It was an enjoyable experience. I learned a lot. But as I actually began to see myself in those roles and see myself caught up in the bureaucracy around what they deemed to be customer service, I wanted to learn more about the communities these banks are doing business in. With that thought in mind, I dug into the demographics in the communities, things such as the overdraft fees and how financial gaps are mainly hurting non-whites negatively, all the way around. Some of the information that I uncovered, it just kind of hits at the core of why we are still having this conversation. So let me share some of the findings that I was able to uncover over the last 6 years in my last 6 years in banking. okay? So in 2017, banks made $34 billion in overdraft fees of people who literally had no money. $34 billion from people who literally had no money. People of color pay more than white people in the US for fees at banks. To give you an example, 90% of fee income generated from banks comes from overdraft fees. And what I uncovered in the communities from the banks that I was working in is that the majority of the demographics were people on Social Security, people who were living paycheck to paycheck, and people who lived in those public housings that are surrounding these banks that are making money. So $34 billion in overdraft fees. 22% of whites spend money on bank fees. So that means that that other percentage do not. 60% of Blacks pay monthly fees in banks, and 59% of Hispanics pay monthly fees. Other issues that are impacting people of color are credit scores. I'm not going to go too much into credit scores, but that is another major matter when it comes to the financial industry and how individuals are being impacted. Another point I want to bring out is actual debt that are impacting individuals. This includes student loans, credit card debt. What I uncovered is that Black women have the most outstanding debt in the US compared to white women. Black women, single Black women, have the most outstanding debt. When it comes to student loans, the average Black student will have almost up to $8,000 more in student loan debt than the average white person. It takes 21 years to pay off a student loan debt, on average. So if a Black person has that much more of a gap between what they have to pay back with an average of 21 years, how much longer is that going to take them? What is that going to do to their pockets and their bottom line? And when we think about how much housing they're going to be able to afford when they're trying to educate themselves, better themselves, and pull themselves away from this type of situation where affordable housing or subsidy housing is the only thing that they can afford right now. Other issues, again, with lending and interest fees, all disproportionately impact Black families. And even though I'm saying historically, Blacks are still the most discriminated group in the US today. I'm not disregarding or eliminating any other groups such as Native Americans, Hispanic, Indigenous people. These all kind of fall onto the umbrella, but as a hierarchy, historically, Blacks are the most impacted by these racist practices in financial institution. African-American women make 61 cents for every dollar that white women make. The average Black family has 0 to a negative net worth. The average Black family in the United States has a 0 to negative net worth. How much housing can we afford? So when we get back to talking about policies and systems and some of these things that were enacted hundreds of years ago to protect people from being victims of these type of practices, such as the Community Reinvestment Act that was established in 1977, fair lending, the Reg B, which is a policy or regulations within banking, prohibits lenders from discriminating against people because of credit applications, on their credit applications, and they have to do a written notification. Reg V is fair credit reporting, and the Fair Housing Act, and the Equal Opportunity Act, which all of these policies were created to protect people. But when we talk about policies and systems, we can see they're flawed significantly, harshly, abusively. And these are the people who are supposed to be in charge taking care of us. The next thing I want to bring up is the community attitude. Now, I just learned this term called NIMBYism, and I'm sure you guys have heard about it. So what is the community's attitude when we think about where we want to create an infrastructure with affordable housing? NIMBYism says, not in my neighborhood. That's not going to happen here. So the concern about the decrease in their neighborhood wealth, or what types of behaviors or other types of things that are going to come into their neighborhood, which is going to cause problems. So they will fight against that before they welcome that. It's a natural response for all people when you think about who's moving into your neighborhood. The last thing that I want to talk about as far as the major matters for me is housing in general. So what I've learned and uncovered is affordable housing, public housing are different according to the government and how they regulate it. So affordable housing is any home rented or owned in which the costs comprise less than 30% of their monthly income. So this is affordable housing. So the government looks at people's income. That's a notable thing. Kudos to them. They look at incomes and then they try to create affordable housing. The problem with this is that those are limited, right? So they may be the nicer neighborhoods, they may be the more quality of apartments or housing, but there's only so many that's going to be available to individuals. Why? Because affordable housing is privately owned. So these owners, whether they own buildings or single houses, whatever that is, they get tax breaks for creating a significant amount or a minimum amount, whatever that looks like, to create units in which individuals can use their income to move in. So another thing is Section 8 or subsidy housing, right? But then we get into public housing. Who runs public housing? 100%. Our governments. 100%. And they can decide where they want to, again, create an infrastructure of public housing anywhere they want to. Again, you will have neighborhoods and communities that will fight against that, but the government has the power to do that. But think about it. Where are they located, right? I can't help when I think about public housing, I can't help but think about segregation. Due to the fact that in 1933, right after the Great Depression, when the government started analyzing mortgage lending, you know what they did when they did that? They created a perfect portrait for racism. A perfect portrait of racism. So paint that in your mind. See the redlining. See how the government is in control of this process. And how even back in the 30s, that decision was influenced by other people who had the wealth within those neighborhoods. So they can go to the governors or the government in their communities and say, hey, I know you're thinking about putting a public housing, but here's a couple of dollars, or, I got your name for if you want to get elected next year. All of these kind of ploys and games and manipulative things that they do, but they're in cahoots with each other, and it causes friction and it causes issues. It causes segregation. But where do these public houses end up? This segregation and the creation of public housing makes Blacks, Native Americans, Latinos, Asians, and other people who are identified as people of color citizens of the probability of being in this segregated type of arena. So public housing, when we think about the social determinants of health, public housing is a significant contributor to those deficits. Significant. So I'm going to talk about just a couple. Economic stability is one of the social determinants. Education, health and healthcare, transportation. There are 12. But two that I just want to speak about briefly that impact, that are directly related to the public housing issue. And that one is neighborhood and built environments. Neighborhoods and built environments. Now, what do I mean by that? And why is this a critical component of affordable housing? What happens in these neighborhoods where affordable housing is erected? What are the attitudes of the individuals? What do they have access to? So when we think about where affordable housing or public housing is situated, there are bodegas, there are liquor stores, there are parks that have no swings, there are roads that are dilapidated, they are in places where some of the buildings have been abandoned, Burger Kings, and I just talked to my daughter the other day, and we just took a journey up State Street where we live. From the time you get off of Main Street, maybe about a half a mile when you take that left, that is all you see. From the time you hit Stick, Springfield Technical Community College, to where Boston Road meets and you get right back into the affluent areas, that's all you see. There's not a supermarket where these public housings goes. And lastly, social and community context. And before I move on, I just want to talk briefly about, I grew up in a projects. It was called Reed Village. And in 1972, that's where I lived. Now, probably less than a half a mile away, and there was a road, it was called the Causeway, that connected Reed Village to another village. It was called Amor Village. But this wasn't a project. This was a neighborhood of single family homes where affluent people lived within a quarter of a mile away from each other. We went to the same schools, we went to the same grocery stores, but guess what? People from Amor Village was not trying to visit me in Reed Village, but I was trying to visit them in Amor Village because they looked like they had so much more. And the people who lived in Reed Village were reminded that you are in public housing, stacked on top of each other. How does that really benefit and help people to remain healthy, to think about being healthy? It changes attitudes. The social and community context references the relationships. What relationships that happen in these type of restricted and segregated spaces?
Tracy, we've got 1 minute for you.
All right, thank you very much. In order to address the overall relationship between affordable housing and health, we cannot overlook the significance of where these structures are erected. The paternalistic attitude says what? We give them something, we have affordable housing, you should be grateful, take it, you have a place to live. The neoliberalists will say, if you work harder, you can get up out of these situations. Neither of those are true. So I do have some references for the information that I was able to research. Just the other quickly, the median value of the family net worth, whites families, $171,000 annually, Black African-Americans, $17,000, Hispanics, $28,000, and other or multiple races are about $64,000. So where does those dollars get people and people of color, and how do we move them to want to accumulate wealth by home ownership? So thank you very, very much. I enjoyed this, and thank you, Doug, for the time reminder.
Thank you, Tracy. And we will have conversation after this. And I'm sure we'll come back to many of the points that you raised. But as we look at corporate capitalism and the impact it has, we can't ignore the disproportionate impact it has on communities of color, especially the African-American community. And so important to lead off with that. Next, Giampaolo Beacci, who is director of the Urban Democracy Lab, professor of individualized studies in sociology at NYU, and author of several books. He's a sociologist, an ethnographer interested in questions of politics and culture, critical social theory, and cities. Beacci was one of the founders of the Participatory Budgeting Project and continues to work with groups improving urban democracy. He heads Gallatin's Urban Democracy Lab, which launched in 2014 and which provides a space for scholars and practitioners to collaborate and exchange ideas for cultivating just, sustainable, and creative urban futures. Giampaolo, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me this evening. Forget all that about the biography. The most important thing you need to know is that I am a friend of and fan of Franklin County CPR, and I always appreciate being with you at your events. I'm constantly moved by just the awesome energy and critical thinking you all bring to your activism. And I tell everyone who will listen that we have to be watching you all very carefully, because I think you're up to some excellent things that people need to know about. So thank you for having me tonight. Thank you to the Davids, Judy, Doug, for putting this together, and to Gabby for providing technical support. And thank you so much, Tracy, for getting us started with those powerful and thoughtful words. I'm going to talk a little bit, I want to pick up a little bit on what Tracy and Doug were talking about, which is, if corporate capitalist housing is not good in terms of meeting human needs, what is the alternative? You know, all the time people talk about our failed housing system in the United States, and the numbers are indeed shocking for the wealthy country that the United States is. But it is a successful system in terms of generating wealth, which is why I appreciated Doug's prompt that we begin to think about housing as a commodity and what would it mean to decommodify housing. Tracy was very thoughtful in talking about all the racist and awful legacies that public housing has. Public housing, as many people know, has a, beginning with the Housing Act in 1949, has an awful racist history of being segregated. And people who look at it more closely will tell you that public housing was almost designed to fail, right? Unlike social housing in other countries, there's no middle class in it. It's underfunded every year. So what is the alternative? And what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is this idea of social housing. Social housing, for me and for people like me who advocate these kinds of things, is housing that is at least partially decommodified, that is not on the market, that it's community controlled, and that is publicly backed. So social housing really provides a bottom-up, resident and community controlled, permanently affordable, quality kind of housing. So public housing is not on the market, but we don't think of it as social housing because, as Tracy was saying, residents and communities have no control over it. So let me tell you a little bit about the idea. Unfortunately, my colleague, Jake Carlson, couldn't be with us tonight, but I want to tell you a little bit about this idea that we have had, that we've been talking about, the Social Housing Development Authority. We really believe that we are at an inflection point in terms of housing policy in this country. And we really do see an opportunity for activists and unions and movements and advocates to really make a push for something like, for opening the door for transition to another kind of housing policy. I think we're at an inflection point for two reasons. One, we are at the verge of a generation-defining housing crisis. No matter what actually comes in terms of vouchers, emergency vouchers and moratoria, a lot of people are likely going to be evicted. And two, ideologically, there's something that has changed very drastically, I think, about the role of government intervention in the economy. There's lots to disagree with in Biden's American Jobs Plan, but it is a plan for government intervention in the economy. Its intervention in housing, however, needs to be pushed to the left. It needs to be pushed towards a vision of social housing. Nearly all the tools that are talked about being deployed with the American Jobs Plan are home ownership incentive tools and not the kinds of social housing that I'm going to be talking about. So to explain this idea a little bit, we have to go backwards in time to something Doug was also talking about, which is the crisis of 2008. If we go back to 2008, the financial crisis that would reverberate for years started to take off. People who had been looking to become homeowners got offered bad deals by big banks looking to make money. And as everything came tumbling down, the banks made those bad deals and started to blame it on the homeowners, mostly Black and Latino families, and went on a foreclosure spree. Some people were able to fight to stay in their homes, but in the end, millions lost. After the 2008, in the aftermath of 2008 crisis, the difference between Black and white home ownership was worse than it had been during the end of the Jim Crow era, to give you an idea of where this impact was mostly felt. Then enter private equity. Investment companies got the idea they could buy up all those empty homes and turn them into rentals. In some cases, they'd actually rent them to the same people that they used to own it. They amassed 250,000 of those homes and turned them into rentals, in addition to the other ones bought by investors. At the end, the crisis was a massive transfer of wealth and property out of the hands of communities and into Wall Street. For those living under the new corporate landlords, they struggled with increasing rents, poor maintenance, and more evictions. Fast forward to today, we have this global pandemic, millions have been out of work, there is this rescue package, but tens of millions of tenants are still on the hook. Eventually, eviction moratoria will expire. And even the most aggressive of the rescue measures only take us back 2 or 3 months and they don't go forward. In other words, people's housing precarity will be the very same that it used to be. Some people estimate that even with the rescue package, some 20 to 40 million tenants are possibly facing eviction, something that will disproportionately affect communities of color. Right now, the estimate is between 1 in 4 Black and Latino families are behind in rent. Landlords are in comparatively better shape. They have mortgage forbearance and so on, but they too are beginning to go into foreclosure or have to think about putting their properties for sale. Enter our old friend, private equity. Investors are calling the fallout from the pandemic a bonanza. One of the greatest buying opportunities of the century, the CEO of Blackstone, Steven Schwarzman, said in an interview. Blackstone was a huge winner coming out of the global financial crisis, and something similar is going to happen. Private equity is currently sitting on $300 billion of what they call dry powder to invest in distressed assets. So how can we prevent the repeat of this crisis? So to do that, we have proposed this National Social Housing Development Authority that would purchase this distressed property. And by distressed, to be specific, we mean an owner is behind on mortgage, property taxes, or other bills. In a nutshell, this authority would buy out distressed assets, rehab it to livability environmental standards, cutting out the speculators, and then transfer to the social housing sector. By doing this, the authority would decommodify chunks of housing. That is, it would reduce the extent to which the cost and access to housing is determined by the private market, thereby helping to expand affordability and access for all. Our idea, if this authority would aggressively pursue this distressed real estate, it would have to work nimbly and swiftly in order to crowd out speculative investors. If we imagine, for example, a rental apartment building going into distress, the authority could buy them after they go into foreclosure or proactively, if it seems like it's going to go into foreclosure. It would hold it for some period of time. Some people we've worked with are estimating that this hold period might be as long as 2 or 3 years to make sure that people have livable and environmentally safe apartments and units. We know that landlords of distressed properties begin skimping on maintenance at first sign of trouble. Then the authority would transfer the housing to an eligible entity. This might be a tenant cooperative, a community land trust, a mission-driven nonprofit, or it could transfer to or expand our dwindling stock of public housing as long as the new units met these social housing standards. These kinds of entities that I'm talking about, the community land trusts and so on, have a track record of preserving long-term affordability and promoting democratic community control over housing. By doing this, we hope this authority would crowd out the speculative market and turn property permanently into the hands of community. Two important parts of this, since we were talking, Tracy was talking a little about money and banking. The SHDA would provide low-cost financing. In many cases, we estimate would have to subsidize the sale so that people, so the cooperatives purchase at an affordable rate. That said, we expect the authority would actually get some revenue back. We think too that this does not need to be limited to housing. We think there's distress in commercial real estate, like hotels and office spaces. These have been hit by less travel, people working from home, and the trend that actually is continuing. We think all of these could be converted into high quality residential housing. So one of the things we propose too is that the authority have the power to develop and build new social housing. So while the 2008 crisis hit homeowners primarily, this current crisis, even with the vouchers that are coming, will land much more heavily on renters. Still, we expect that SHDA would have the power to help struggling homeowners, and this would be especially important in communities of color, where homeownership has been an important pillar of community stability. For homeowners in distress, the authority would have the power to buy the mortgages from lenders and then renegotiate the terms or refinance. A slight couple of technical things people in the audience probably know. In the United States today, you cannot build more public housing. The Faircloth Amendment, for every unit of housing that you build, you have to destroy one. So this would have to be revealed. And then there's a very nice piece of legislation out of DC called the TOPA, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, that would have to be put in place nationally. A couple of more things, since one of the things I think it's interesting for us to talk about is meeting the housing emergencies that we have in places like Franklin County, but also thinking about the longer term transition to a broader housing system that at least at the affordable end has a large social component, social housing component. So how do we make sure something like the SHDA works and stays committed to the goals of expanding affordable housing? One, we imagine it would have to be an activist board to run it with designated seats from people who work with low-income housing, as well as tenant leaders. We expect the SHDA would have to be working all over the country and have local offices and establish relationships with local housing organizations. Two, the SHDA would have to have an explicitly redistributive mission. It would target areas of vulnerable communities, and particularly those previously subject to racially predatory practices like redlining, abandonment, and predatory lending. The institution would seek to undo a legacy of harms and not be captured by the racist logics that drove some of the New Deal agencies. It would have to have very strong guardrails in place to make sure these cooperatives that we develop do not revert back to private housing. Finally, and this is extremely important to us, the SHDA would not be funded by regular congressional appropriations. We know from all of our other experiences with housing funding that housing is always first on the chopping block, and it's a convenient punching bag for politicians. It would have to have its own pool of resources it can refill, and by recapturing some of the costs of real estate through sales, it would make the money go further. They say never let a good crisis go to waste. Crises provide moments where people re-examine the way things were, they can be open to deeper change. And among the many systemic problems we have in the US, housing is a deeply profound one, central to racial and class inequalities. If its problems were long-standing before COVID, and if we don't do something fundamental and structural, will persist after it. A couple of more points, and then I would love to hear your thoughts and discussion. By itself, the SHDA would not be a guarantee, though, of a humane and rational housing policy that puts lives before profits and communities over commodities. But it can provide important movement in that direction. It could decommodify chunks of housing at a time of crisis, provide powerful working examples, while taking that housing out of the hands of speculators and providing permanently affordable housing. In doing so, we would hopefully begin to build a broad-based support for social housing. But we expect that to address our housing crisis will require a whole suite of policies, We expect we'd have to have national regulation of the real estate industry, rent controls and rent caps. We would have to have fiscal equalization policies, which I'm happy to talk about, and the new construction of social housing units. The 2008 crisis caught everyone flat-footed, and we know the results: massive foreclosures, bailout for banks, and zero accountability for Wall Street. This time it's different though. We have a national tenant movement invigorated like we haven't seen in ages. Rent strikes took place all over the country. Conversations like the ones we're having tonight are happening everywhere. The depth of the crisis is so profound that people are finally starting to understand that people can end up with evictions due to forces entirely out of their control. We now have the possibility to bring the power and resources of the federal government to do something fundamental and structural, to bail out people, of course, rather than banks, but more fundamentally help move us in the direction of a decommodified and social housing system. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianpaolo. One of the things that struck me as both of you were talking was that essentially everything that happened that has created and maintained this gross inequality has been quote unquote legal. And so the changing policy is pretty essential in terms of how that happens, but policy doesn't change unless we push, unless we work together and organize, and that's why we're here. So a couple of things about how we're going to do the conversation now. We have a few people who have signed up on chat to talk, and I'll get to them in just a moment. If you want to comment on what somebody has said, I mean, this conversation that we're going to have now is not just for the panelists, but for all of us. If you would like to say something as in reaction to what's on the floor, the reaction tab on the bottom of your screen has a place where you can click raise hand. And if you do that, we will know to call on you. That's different than being in an order to ask a question. So there are two different things going on. If you want to ask a question, write stack in the chat. If you want to comment on whatever question is being considered on the floor, go to the reaction tab on the bottom of your screen and click on the raise hand, and we will bring you into the conversation at that point. So hopefully that makes sense, or will as we go. I know we've all done way too many Zooms over the last year, so you probably have already figured much of that out. Susan Triolo was first on the list to ask a question or make a comment. So if you would unmute yourself, welcome, Susan.
Hi, everybody. This is my third housing workshop. Thank you. It's wonderful. I wanted to ask Tracy, since you mentioned State Street in Springfield. I was a Springfield teacher for 14 years. My first school was downtown, and then I worked at Indian Orchard. And I was in Springfield the day that the tornadoes hit. And I wonder if you can tell us anything about any progress. I have not heard anything of progress on the promised housing from MGM in Springfield.
I'm speechless with that right now. MGM has backpedaled on pretty much every promise that they've made to support the city of Springfield. And that has nothing to do with, of course, what just happened with COVID. But even before the casino was complete, they started downsizing. They started pushing people away. They started talking about what they can't do rather than what they could do. So I do believe that they have put some money into putting some of the trees back in some of the neighborhoods where the trees have actually were damaged due to the tornado. I am not sure that they did support a few houses for reconstruction and a few houses that went up, but it's nowhere near what they had actually committed themselves to do as a commercial institution within the city of Springfield. People are quite disappointed, and thank you so much for asking that.
Thank you.
Susan Wargafnik, you're next.
Okay, I have two questions, one for Tracy and one for John Paulo. My Tracy question is, you were talking about the inequities in the mortgage system itself and the structural inequities there. And I was wondering if you have, or if anyone else has, any understanding of alternative ways of helping people get that equity to be able to own a home that is not just based on credit scores, et cetera, but is based on other things. And I was wondering if anyone has tried to do that, and if so, what they use.
Well, thank you, Susan, for that question. I can honestly say that that has been at the core of my research since I actually left the bank. And I actually created a presentation to present specifically to the banks, to invite them to look at those specific policies that are impacting people based on their credit score, based on the amount of fees that they're paying, and how are they really using their Community Reinvestment Act. So this is just not a basic presentation. I'm challenging you, I'm asking you, go and look at your numbers. Look at those percentages. What do you see? And then invite me back so we can talk about that. And I think the only real way to get to the heart of it is to have the individuals, particularly some of the smaller banks, to begin to dismantle, analyze, and look at some of their processes that are existing and find out who they actually impact and do something about it. And me being in this community right now, I'm going to be pretty much, I want to say, in their faces, and I want to hold them accountable once I have showed up and knocked at their door and giving them the opportunity to look. Please look. There's some risk associated with it. I get it, with your professional and your regulatory, because banks are one of the most highly regulated institutions in our world. So I get it, but I'm like imploring them and not talking to them in an impressive way. I'm looking to inspire them and encourage them to take a deeper look. So more to come. I'm not giving up on that. I can tell you that. Thanks,
Thank you.
Susan.
Thank you. John Paulo.
Excuse me, Susan,
Yeah.
before we jump to that, I
Okay.
see that Gwen
Okay.
Nabad, is that how you pronounce it, has her hand up. I don't know if it's specifically to this question or not, but I wanted to check in. And then David Greenberg has his hand up as well.
Great.
So I just, I didn't know if you were going to go there, Susan, but what keeps coming up for me is how it starts right with the real estate broker themselves and how they screen people and do their demographics. And I wouldn't know that, but the woman that raised me was a real estate broker and I was a fly on the wall. And, I heard it all. And of course, it didn't make me feel good to have that knowledge, but that is what happens. And so I almost have felt at times like, well, I wonder if anyone has ever mystery shopped real estate brokers, what's going on in that, is there an activist out there who wants to do a little mystery shopping, because, it happens every day, all the time. So that's a huge barrier. And I could say the same for single parents, which I have been for 33 years. And also the other thing I wanted to talk about that sort of came up a little bit was what sort of got me thinking about was predatory loaning. People who are impoverished are very prone to predatory loaning. They get into a situation where, they can't even, they don't have an additional week of money in the bank in case something goes wrong with the car that's getting them to the job at Dunkin' Donuts. And, then the car dies and all of a sudden it's like this huge, big deal. It turns into everything, and so now, it's like, oh, maybe we should just get a loan and get this car. It'll run well for a while, but you're actually buying a car that's like, it makes it right to the warranty, that kind of a thing. So there's a lot of barriers. There's a lot of things that make people really vulnerable to having good credit. And then also there are other demographics that make people vulnerable to predatory loaning.
Great. Thank you, Gwen.
Thanks.
Lily Linke has just commented there are fair housing testers, she says. They are basically secret shoppers for realtors and landlords. So in response to Gwen's question, David, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to ask people what they thought of the idea of having co-signers on mortgages to help people get a mortgage. I know that there's a group in Springfield that's doing this with renters. People often don't have the credit ratings and all that stuff. And this is something that people can maybe help with by co-signing on a lease. Maybe that could happen on a mortgage also. I don't know.
Great, thanks. Susan, you had a second question, so let's
Yes.
come back to you.
Talking to Gianpaolo about the whole question of social housing development. You've been talking about this as a national project. Can this be a state project? Or do the economics not work because of the structures? I'm just curious.
No, we presented, we have the federal proposal because we are now back in the era of big government. So we got to say big government things, but we actually think this can work very well at the state level because as those of you who know real estate know that the state government is actually more deeply involved in real estate transactions. And it can work very positively at the municipal and local level as well. You know, the sort of hand waving that a proposal has is the funding aspect. So we imagine the power of the federal government would be able to simply purchase more and do more. And when we look at, you know, some municipalities, we don't necessarily see the capacity to do that kind of funding. But that said, there are interesting examples of municipalities doing creative things with their funding. Fundamentally, yeah, so it's a matter of who's able to do some of the financing, but it's well within the capacity of larger municipalities, we think, to do some of these projects. Oh, and one more thing, Susan, is interesting. Municipalities also, you know, it's also partially a matter of political will and sort of the political conditions at any one place. You know, municipalities, for example, have police powers to take over properties that are tax delinquent. Municipalities would have actually technically have the police power to take over properties that are so badly managed that they're violation the conditions of habitability. But yeah, so, and I think an interesting thing that some municipalities have been doing is some of these land bank kind of ideas, which we think are interesting.
I guess I do mean to put you on the spot. MJ, I saw you nodding vigorously as Gianpaolo was talking. I wonder if I could invite you into the conversation for a minute.
Well, his point about the capacity is a critical one. The funding is certainly one thing, but then even if you have funding, the capacity of a housing agency to be able to manage those properties, rehab them, and manage them. I think that is the critical piece. And, you know, that's what the Franklin County area has struggled with, that to have a housing. We have a regional housing authority. We have Greenfield Housing Authority. Both of them have nonprofits, but that hasn't been, we simply don't have in Franklin County the development capacity for somebody to be able to do that. Even the funding was available. Concept is great. We certainly have, you know, candidate properties that I could give you a list of today that are on their way to receivership, that are tax delinquent, but the tax delinquency process in Massachusetts, there is a certain time frame that it has to live through. And the other challenge that we have is that these are small scale properties. You know, to manage scattered site, 2, 3, 4 unit properties is much more challenging for a housing organization to do than a 1, you know, 30 unit development that might be an entirely appropriate candidate for what Gianpaolo is talking about in terms of the social housing. But it's great to have this conversation about other ways about thinking about this housing issue and how critical it is for housing to be a baseline, basic necessity that people have access to at a place that they can afford, so that they, it's the basis of being able to do the other things that you have the potential to do in your life. If you don't have housing, usually everything else around you is going astray. So I think it's in the community and the government's best interest to find a different way of doing things than we've been doing it for a while.
And MJ, I really like just to respond to MJ, I really like what you're saying, MJ, and it makes me think of what a pernicious system we have of funding, because in essence, the municipalities wind up having to deal with the problem. It's just sort of where people go, and they're the ones that are least funded, and it's an unfunded mandate. And this is why we propose it federally, but we imagine, and the other thing is people in municipalities know what to do. People at municipal government and at local authorities have the know-how. So we don't imagine this being some giant thing from DC that's going to impose the same kind of social housing, but the funding would have to come from there.
Right. And I think that somebody said it, I heard it today somewhere, I'm not exactly sure where, that never lose the opportunity that you have in this type of crisis. That we should be taking a look at this moment where there's clearly some public money that is being invested, not just thrown at, but invested, or we're given the opportunity to make an investment in changing things that haven't been working for a long time. I've been in affordable housing since I came out of grad school in the 80s. And, we always talked about the crisis of affordable housing in Massachusetts. Well, we've never stopped using the word crisis. And I keep on saying, when do we finally acknowledge that this is a structural issue and not just a crisis? A crisis you can resolve. We have not resolved this crisis. It is a structural issue in how we're dealing with housing, access to housing in Massachusetts and this country. In a system that we have built. And that's what I keep on telling people. This is not a natural system that operates according to laws of nature. This is something that humans and our minds have crafted, and we built it, we can change it. And that's the challenge.
That's crucial, and it's important. I get hung up on pronouns sometimes, and deciding who we are, who built this system. We know whose backs it was built on, but who made the decisions about how it went. It's another set of pronouns. Pam Goodwin, you are next.
Hi, thank you for taking my stack. So I just wanted to make a statement and point out that a bunch of my friends stopped an eviction in Shrewsbury. They had to circle the house. There were 5 doors to cover. And by 9, they were to meet there at 9, and by 9:30 they won. So this couple was able to do the bankruptcy thing and call a screeching halt to them being evicted, which means padlock the doors. You can't get any of your stuff out of your own home. And so I just wanted to call that to your attention as something that maybe people are already doing and I'm unaware of. But I do know a woman who was Afro-American in Boston when I went down to fight evictions, and it didn't work for her. She was a grandmother. She had her daughter and grandchildren living. They had a court injunction, and she lost everything. And she was on public television. Well, she was on a television camera telling her story. So this ended beautifully, 30 minutes, and they solved the problem with a handful of people surrounding that house. They were also told that it would be illegal if they were arrested. I kind of wonder about that because I know what some cops can be up to and the sheriff and so forth. My second point that I wanted to ask, I think Gianpaolo talked about it. I think it's really important to know that when a public housing building has been, for instance, condemned or it needs remodeling, those displaced people have the right to either be put up in a motel or to be going to another housing facility. And that is rarely the case. They become homeless, then they have to fight for how they can get back into whatever new building or a different building. And unless you've got a really good attorney, which of course they don't have in their pocket, that's part of the homeless population that I think people should be aware of. And I've been in public housing for going on 7.5 or 8 years now, both state and then federal. So I just wanted to point that out. And if you have any response, any of the panelists, I'd love to hear it.
Thank you, Pam. And just what you said about people coming out to deal with evictions, it sounds to me like there was a lot of that went on in the 1930s. I mean, I think that was the community regularly would come in response to potential evictions and stop them one way or another. So there is precedent for it. Any other response to what Pam had to say before we
I
move
just
on?
want to say thank you, Pam, for sharing that, because I think a lot of times people don't know their rights and they don't know what they're entitled to once that process starts. So whether it's fear, ignorance, and I think at some point maybe providing a source of education with regards to how they can protect themselves. My friend works, she's the executive director for Rise for Social Justice. And I know that part of what they do is help people who've been evicted kind of transition, and they put them up into a space for the night when I think the Public Housing Authority is supposed to support them, but then they end up referring them to Arise for Social Justice, and they end up working tirelessly at night to find a place for them. So just the point of helping people to know their rights is pretty powerful, Pam. Thank you.
Tracy, do you have some thoughts about, or anyone else, of how we might bring about some of that education? I mean, where and how might we take those steps to help people know what's possible?
Well, definitely spaces, nonprofit organizations such as Arise for Social Justice. I mean, part of their responsibility to the community is advocacy, whether it's for environmental issues, whether it's for housing rights, but just to be able to maybe put together some type of targeted pamphlet or a sheet where we can actually get people to those sources and provide them with the information that they may need. I get a little like touchy talking about it because I still have like this sore spot in my heart for public housing and what it really does for many, many people, even though for years they may feel like they're in a safe space, but that little bit that they have accumulated at some point can be taken away from them when they had very little from the beginning. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for the sore spot in your heart for caring so deeply. Now, the next person who is on stack, I don't know if it's Murray Nevin or Nevin Murray. Both names are there, and I don't know which one comes first, but you're up.
Hi, sorry. Juan Paul actually answered my question mostly, as well as MJ. It just had to do with, actually, it was, I had heard about it in a paper that mentioned TOPA that Juan Paul might have been reading, or I don't know, or it was about just what LA could do post-COVID for their housing crisis. It was just about using eminent domain on like not delinquent, but just like historically, I guess, landlords that were just historically terrible in terms of like tenants' rights and evictions and all of that. And as well as like using on that type of like large sort of corporate landlord, and then also on buildings that were about to have their affordability covenants expire. But I guess, but then MJ sort of pointed out that there's just not enough money, and yeah, I don't know. So I guess, yeah, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, Tracy or Juan Paulo. or MJ or anybody else. But that was my question.
This is MJ. You know, there's the acquisition cost, you know, or in some ways, if there's a troubled property, you have to find some way to gain control of it. And there are different ways of doing that. There's the receivership process, which usually means that a building's in pretty nasty condition at that point. And the challenge is finding, you need to pair a property that's distressed with a contractor or a property manager who has the financial wherewithal to be able to reach into their pocket and to pay for those rehabs so that they can get it back up to habitability and then be able to take the next step in the legal process so they gain an ownership, the way to own it. They don't own it until the end of the receivership process where they actually auction their receiver lien that the court allows them to put in place. So it's geared towards a very limited number of people who already have access to capital, who may already be very deeply invested in the system that exists. And the question is, how do we find a different system so that housing can be in the social portfolio rather in the private portfolio, so that the housing that is there serves the needs of the people rather than the profit making or capitalist or wealth accumulation process that we've created our economic system to reward. And so that's the challenge there, is taking housing out of being a commodity to housing being a social good that has public investment in it, has the folks who are participating and living in that home have some say about, not only about, well, have some democracy in terms of how that housing is run and kept up and how that community is created and sustained, but also have that stability of being able to have that long-term stability of knowing that their housing is not going to go away and that that they have some degree of control over the quality of their housing.
Thanks,
I don't know
MJ.
that was abundantly articulate, but the idea was really shifted away from being a private good for wealth accumulation to a public good that's invested in by the community for the
Right.
benefit of people who need housing.
I guess I should clarify and say that it was to in order to transfer, it was to do that, to transfer ownership from private landlords to the city, and then the idea was to reallocate it to the proper organizations, CLTs or co-ops or other organizations around that, scope.
Yeah, and I'll share with you that municipalities are not in a good position to be
Right.
landlords or property owners.
Right,
That's
sure,
not
yeah.
our the highest and best use of your local government is not to be landlords.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll MJ, you said everything I was going to say except more eloquently. I'll just underline a couple of things that MJ said that are really important. As we've talked about these kinds of ideas around the country, it's nearly universal. Municipalities do not want to be running public housing authorities 2.0 or whatever. So the idea really would be to be doing a transfer to a CLT or a co-op or a tenant co-op or some kind of collective entity. But in talking to people who have experience in doing this, people were saying, look, sometimes that organically exists and sometimes it takes time to be built. So this will take organizing, it will take consciousness raising, it will take a lot of that kind of work. And finally, Tracy said something, MJ said something that is so important in these discussions, which is has to be publicly backed. The idea is not to just transfer this to a co-op and say, good luck. People in some of these instances will be people in difficulties. We're providing this because it's a right. The idea is not to push it off to co-op X. So MJ, thank you very much for your good insight.
I want to mention at this point that there is going to be a workshop on community land trusts. And folks from Burlington, Vermont, talking about what they've done up there. Judy, do you want to say something, a little bit about that? If you don't, it's okay, but if you want to mention something
Right.
about that workshop that's coming.
Yeah, so on the 21st, we're having a workshop at 7 o'clock, and there's going to be a presentation by Brenda Torpy, who originated, I think 40 years ago now, the CLT in Burlington. And for 40 years, it's been growing and successful, and it has all types of housing. It isn't just single family housing, it's apartment buildings and co-ops and emergency housing for, you know, like the previous workshop for people that have problems coming out of prison and stuff. So it has that transitional, it has all kinds of housing. So she's put together, I think it's going to be a great slideshow on CLTs as an alternative. But as Jean Paulo and MJ Adams pointed out, it's not a quick solution. It takes, you know, it takes some creativity and some pushing to be able to put together a community land trust in a community. So it's a lot of work, but once you get it, then you have an alternative to private equity coming in and destroying your community and buying up the houses and stuff. So invite people to come the 21st of April.
Well, and it strikes me that in small pockets, these things are happening. And part of our work is maybe to sort of do the research to find out who is making steps in this direction. So we don't have to invent them all. I mean,
Yeah, we
because
don't have to invent them, but they still take a lot of work.
yes, they do.
Can I ask a question quickly, Doug?
Oh, please.
And it's just in response to MJ and I think Susan and John Paulo. You mentioned that there's money right now that is kind of being freely flown about to kind of support a lot of the breakdowns that have happened since COVID. If not now, we keep talking about the money problems and the challenges and the work. If we can't do this now with the money that is being so freely given, when the hell, excuse my language, can we begin to break or bend? It has to happen now.
Yeah, that's right.
I can't see this next year. I can't see us still having this same conversation next year, trying to figure out where the money's coming from and how we're going to get into these abandoned buildings. And I love that the social housing. I love it. And how the community is actually the overseers and not the government. Now, what can we do now? All of us.
I see Deb McLaughlin has her hand up, and then Susan Wargaftik.
Great, thank you so much, Doug, and thank you so much, John Paulo and Tracy and MJ for your really wonderful and inspiring comments. The question I have is about the points you've made, the important points you've made about speculators and you know, how Wall Street kind of moves in to take advantage of these opportunities off the backs of other folks. And just based on your research and ideas, is there anything communities can do or the states can do to make it more difficult? Taxes, fees, I mean, much in the way that marijuana businesses want to come into communities and they have to pay a community impact fee. Is there anything like that that could make it more challenging or more difficult for them to walk away from a community deal, so to speak? Thank you.
I'll say a couple of things. So sadly, private equity is this dark pool of money with so little oversight. And it's just and it's just disgusting that it makes money on housing. Right? Private equity is disruptive economics. They come in, they downsize and they go, and they get huge returns. And so there's that aspect. It's also just really another awful part of this is that public pensions in many instances are in these pools of private equity. So the public teachers of New York City have money in one of these private equity funds that is actually making the housing where the teachers live worse, because these private equity funds promise these crazy returns, 11% a year. To me, some of the best ideas I've seen, I've seen two. So Elizabeth Warren had this very lengthy bill. Was it last year, the year before? It's a great name, but I can't remember. It was like the End the Looting of America Act or something. And it had regulations on private equity. And in New York State, there's, her name is Zephyr Teachout. She comes out of the union movement. She's a legal scholar, and she's been putting out some ideas about how to regulate this, at least to put some road bumps. But it's a big problem. It's a big problem. You know, by the time we're trying to stop it in Massachusetts or New York State, it's pretty late. Like the fact that there's this parallel banking structure with so little regulation is a big, big problem.
Thank you.
Susan.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that part of the reason we're doing all of this is to develop organizing and structures that can respond to some of these problems. And so I just want to encourage people, as you're thinking about this and talking about it, to really think through, where do you fit and what can you do to help make these changes happen. And there are going to be a lot of different ideas out there. And what we're looking for is people to commit themselves to really be able to work on these things and look at it as a long-term process and not as a quick fix or as a time when we can all sit there and go, that's a problem, and walk away. So I just want to encourage folks, as you know, as you're thinking about the discussion, where you can fit in and what you might be able to do. Thanks.
Let me add to that. Susan has been the prime organizer or mover of this whole thing. So great thanks to her. But one of the through lines to all of it is that this workshop forum is not an end in itself. It's an organizing tool to bring people and ideas together to get to work. Because as Tracy says, if not now, when? And now it's got to be now. So hopefully with this workshop and the others in the series, we keep that in mind, that we're going to keep going. Pam, I don't know if your hand is up because it's still up from before, or if you have another comment. So
Yeah, I'll just briefly, it was up from before, but when someone was saying we need to educate people in public housing, you know, there isn't enough money for when you're fighting an eviction. They'll always say, go talk to community legal aid. They have very little money. They often cannot help anybody. You are up against a lawyer. So the right to counsel is one of the bills that we've been trying forever to pass at the State House, because you're up there, you don't know what you're doing, and you get to fight against a housing lawyer explaining to a judge who has no clue many times and is not going to side in favor of the tenant. So when someone said we need to help people understand their rights, I want to say that's absolutely necessary. And I can tell you that we had to go out into the community. You didn't get the help in your housing authority. You had to go to the select board. You had to go to the Board of Health. You have to go everywhere out in the town. And what the town likes to, what the state housing likes to say is, we are run by the state, but out. So that's illegal, but that's what is constantly being told to municipalities. So I highly encourage people to see if you can help any way that you can, for whatever purposes, with people, because they don't always even have a lease that's in their native language, if you get what I'm talking about. Like the lease can be in English. These are people who speak Spanish, Russian, and whatever. And so it's really difficult for them. And I think that I have the same heart that Tracy's got about this mess that's out there. So I apologize, but that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Can't apologize for having heart. Thank you. Dave Cohen, you're next. See your hands up.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, I think this has been a real exciting discussion. What I take away from it really is that we really do have to think big. We've spent, as someone said, 40, 50 years trying to create affordable, decent housing that's not a commodity, and it hasn't worked. We haven't converted the banks over to being decent people. So I really think we have to look at these bigger ideas of the social housing and how it can be funded. And I think in Massachusetts, there's lots of issues like this. I've been working on Medicare for All. And even though we can show legislators that this will save money, we can provide health care for everyone at lower cost and better health care, the idea of medicine not being a commodity that someone's getting rich off of scares them. And they're really committed to it. And it's the same, I think, for housing. But I think, if we looked at the figures and rolled back the Massachusetts tax structure back to where it was even in the early 1980s, there'd be plenty of money for housing. If corporations and the 1% were taxed at the levels they used to be taxed at, we would have money to create this social housing. So I think it's not an easy road we have to hoe, but the small stuff hasn't worked. And so we have to think bigger because it is a problem that's a major crisis right now. So I'm glad to see that, John Paulo, that you put in the chat the link to your document, because I think it's something we might want to look at and really have discussion. So how would this work on a statewide level? We probably can't implement it in just Greenfield or Shelburne Falls. So how would this work on a statewide level, and begin to have serious talks about that?
And we know that there's a lot of money in the state. It just doesn't get down to us necessarily. MJ.
I just want to share that years ago, back in the 80s when I was in grad school, actually Franklin County was doing some very innovative things with the community land trusts and housing cooperatives. And in some ways, I say it lost its way because Franklin County really was a leader in exploring some of these alternatives. And I think that we should reach back and take a look at what happened, understand what drew them off the path and why it's not a bigger movement. But as I said, when I was in grad school, we were actually believing that Franklin County had some things happening in it that were the more alternative and cooperative type. And so I want you to know that we've got some history in this already, and that we should uncover that and celebrate it, and go back to that earlier legacy and see if we can dust it off and pick it up and move it along. Because we really did, the Franklin Community Land Trust, the Pioneer Valley Housing Cooperative, there are histories here that already have toyed a little with these ideas. So it's in our DNA up here, I think, to do the alternative piece. So let's keep at it.
I just want to say one thing very quickly, and MJ, you were right in my mind when I was thinking about, even though David, you said we have to think bigger, who is the most powerful source within the Greenfield community? Who is that person that can begin to be that louder voice that would speak for the many before we got to Boston? Because when I came into this community, I promise you, I believed that Franklin County was going to be the poster child for this work. I believe that this community is going to set the example of what other communities and counties, and kind of just spread it like a disease so everybody can get on board. You guys have the attitude, the talent, the expertise, the patience, the empowerment, all of these pieces other than the money. We need all of these other pieces, but we keep going back to what the money is. I mean, I get it. I get that we need money, but I think there's something more powerful than actually having those dollars. And that is the unifying of the voices and finding out who these people are. For me, I believe that speaking and staying in the faces of these bank presidents, They have the power to do something. They have the power to make some type of changes for this community right now. So I'm really looking to see something magnificent at the end of the year. And I'm not just, overly ambitious with that. I am not. I have been hearing the same thing over and over again about racial justice work, dismantling systems. How do we make change? And people keep talking about how challenging it is, how much work we got to do. Stop saying that. Stop it. We know that. We already know that. Let's get behind and hold each other up and just get this work done. And I don't care what it is. And I don't mean like literally don't care. But when you start saying to me, oh, well, I'm like, okay, let's push back a little bit. Let's stop saying this. So I just wanted to commend the community. That's all I wanted to do. And I'm glad to be in this community right now, doing racial justice work, focusing on dismantling these systems that keep preventing progress. There's a problem. That's where the problem is. Not the money. Systems. Thank you.
There's one last comment in the chat here. I wonder if the presenters have any thoughts about the equity and sustainability of the Section 8 mobile voucher program. I can read that again if you need it. Otherwise, if the presenters have any thoughts about the equity and sustainability of the Section 8 mobile voucher program, it's from George. And George, if you want to go in, elaborate a little, or if that covers it, we can just go right to the Jean Paulo and Tracy for a response.
I think that's a John Paulo question.
Well done.
Well, I'll say that, and also I wanted to say, give a congratulations to you all. So, the vouchers are a thing I think we have to live with sometimes because of the speed that they can get to people and keep people in places. However, the research and the evidence is really clear that landlords discriminate against people with vouchers. There's all kinds of problems with vouchers. Vouchers wind up lining the pockets of slumlords sometimes. And if you think about it from this kind of social point of view that we're developing tonight, that is public money that we're putting into the system, but with no public stake. It's as MJ was saying, it's kind of like saying 50% of the way housing is a right, kind of, but we're going to give money to some landlords to keep a person in a house, but we're not going to look too closely. I think whenever we spend money with vouchers, the state owns a little bit of that. I think, every time someone accepts a voucher, this is a proposal that's not going to go anywhere. But I think, 1 or 2% of that property now is socially owned because the public has put a stake in it. We've kept the person in the house with our public money because we believe it's a public good. And the evidence, it's super clear that vouchers, people are discriminated against a lot. But let me just say a final thing because I know we're at time. I wanted to congratulate everyone. I love talking with the Continuing Revolution, Franklin County, Greenfield, all you folks very much, because you have something that to me is very special, which is you have a vision, and I feel like all the time I'm talking to people about social housing, and it's such an upsetting idea, actually, to so many people. It's such an upsetting idea. How can you imagine? People all the time, they hear my accent, they think this is some kind of like foreign subversive idea that you're trying to undermine the American dream of owning a home. What could be more un-American than not owning a home and providing people housing outside the market? So I think like us who are progressives on the left or activists, we have to have a vision of what we're for. We're against private equity, we're against badly run, badly managed top-down public housing, but what are we for? We need to have a thing. Maybe it's in the history. Maybe it's, some cooperative, some land trust. Maybe it's Burlington. Maybe it's Vienna, or maybe it's Jackson, Mississippi. But we need to have a thing that we're for and have a clear vision so that we can inspire people. So people will want to live in what will be very nice places. I'm confident the social housing that you're all going to build is going to be wonderful. I cannot wait to come visit. So with that, I'm going to because I know we're at time, but thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, everyone, for talking tonight. It was really wonderful.
And thank you both, Gianpaolo and Tracy, for giving us so much to think about and work with. I wanted to just take a moment. Patience, you had your hand up, and I don't know if you want to say anything or not, but I didn't.
I'm curious. Well, Franklin Greenfield's really much more progressive about affordable housing, but I'm curious if there's a regular report on compliance about the mandates in all of the towns in Western Aston and Franklin County, not just, it just seems so much of the weight ends up in Greenfield. And Greenfield seems so much more proactive about it, and everybody, all the other towns just seem to not be held accountable. And I don't know how much, who's going out and telling the towns that they have to comply and on an ongoing basis, and how much publicity is there out there for people to be providing the affordable housing or buying housing with the intent to provide affordable housing. I'm just curious. I know I waited a long time for Coleraine to write the paperwork to do it, like 3 or 4 years, bought the house, let it sit there. And I just really feel like there's a lot of little people that could be providing and that's the answer, because I've been watching everything go on right now. There's a feeding frenzy. It's exactly like you said. This is about people are putting all their retirement money into real estate trusts, and there's a shakedown going on that's going to be extraordinary in the last year. And they're all waiting for these foreclosures. And it's really scary because the entire economic base of this country is being rearranged. And it's not that as private landlords that we have a right to make a profit, have a right to have an investment, have a right, but I agree with you. You've said over and over again about how you use the word commodity over and over again, but all of the rich men in this country are rich because of real estate. You know, it's just the way it's been. If you look at all of their portfolios, and it's just, I've been getting an incredible education in the last few years. But it's, so that my real question is, how much are the towns being enforced to comply to the mandates? Because I heard the word mandate all those years ago.
I'm gonna stop you there. Susan's got, I think, a response to you, and then we have to wrap it up. But the question's an important one, and again, this whole workshop series, we're not ending here, so that question will sit with us. Susan?
Well, what we're trying to do is, this is going to be on us. We have to, if there are towns that are not doing what we think they should do, we're going to have to figure out a way to make them do it. And so part of what we're trying to do is to get folks organized by town, to look at town issues, and to then come up with a plan for that town. And to go out and to bring others in and to make this all work. So this is an organizing project of a wide scale, and it's going to take a while. But every town that I have 2 people or more will get an email from us that says, this is another person who is in your town who's interested in this. And the idea is to start getting people to work together to try to deal with that town by town, because it's going to be, some things are going to be town by town, some things are going to be issue by issue, some things are going to be, we have to go to the state. But we're going to try to figure out what all those things are and make it work. And so I'm just really thankful that all of you are here and are interested in trying to make that happen. Thanks.
So we're going to close up for the evening. Thank you all for being here, here with heart and mind, and caring about how we house and care for all of us in our communities. This workshop series, there are 9 total workshops. This is with the second one. Next week at 7 o'clock on the 15th, there's a workshop on resident-owned communities, manufactured homes, communities that have essentially bought their land together and have organized themselves. So We hope you will join us. You can go to the website housingishumanright.com to sign up for that or any other workshops in the series. We'll also be sending out emails, as Susan said, to help keep us connected together. So thank you again for being with us tonight. Dave Cohen, David Greenberg, Judy Atkins, and I organized this workshop, and we look to join you at other ones. And have a good evening. We've got work to do. Let's get out and do it.
Thank you.